It's strange how the smallest moments can split your life into before and after. For me, it wasn't some grand disaster, not at first. It was just lunch, a simple lunch I had promised my mother-in-law after a morning of errands. I was 32, then a woman who had spent years trying to stitch together an image of a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, the kind of woman who never let the mask slip, even when she was exhausted or quietly breaking inside. That day, the sun was too bright, the air heavy with the kind of spring warmth that sticks to your skin. My mother-in-law, Irene, had insisted we eat at one of those little bistros downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and waiters who raised their eyebrows if you didn't order wine with lunch. I remember feeling tense the moment we sat down, as though the walls themselves were closing in, but I brushed it off. Irene was in rare form, sharp-tongued, restless every word she spoke, carrying that subtle sting I had grown so used to over the years. She had a way of cutting me down without raising her voice, a way of making every kindness feel like an obligation I could never repay. Still, I smiled. Still, I played the role. Because I had been conditioned to believe that keeping the peace, even when it tasted like poison, was better than facing the truth that lay underneath. When the bill came, I didn't think twice. I reached into my bag, pulled out my card, and slid it into the black leather folder. But the waiter came back moments later, holding it out to me with that practiced, polite smile that made my stomach twist. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This card's been declined." I blinked. That had never happened before. My hands felt clumsy as I pulled out another card, then another. Declined. Declined. All of them. By the fourth attempt, my palms were slick with sweat, my throat tightening. Irene sat across from me, her lips curling into the faintest smirk, her eyes sharp with judgment. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough volume that the table beside us turned to look. My cheeks burned. I stammered something about calling the bank, about how it must be some mistake. But in that moment, with the waiter shifting awkwardly and Irene tapping her fingers against the table, I felt something inside me crack. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was fear. A cold, creeping fear that something had shifted behind the scenes of my life, and I was the last to know. Irene ended up paying for lunch, her sigh loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. As we walked back to the car, she muttered under her breath, "A woman should always know what's happening in her household." Imagine the shame if anyone else had been there. Shame. That word stuck like glass in my chest, because that was the currency my husband Daniel and his family dealt in. Shame was their tool, their leash, and I had worn it around my neck for so long, I had almost forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. When I got home, I called the bank. My voice trembled as I gave them my information, waited through the silence. And then, with clinical detachment, the woman on the other end explained that every account in my name, every joint account, every line of credit, had been frozen. Blocked. Not by the bank. By Daniel. I remember sitting on the floor of the kitchen, the phone slipping from my hand, the sound of the refrigerator humming in the silence. Daniel had left for a business trip 2 days earlier, kissing my cheek as he wheeled his suitcase out the door, his smile as polished as always. But now, with the truth sitting in front of me, I realized it wasn't business. It was betrayal. That night, I tore through drawers, cabinets, files, anywhere I thought I might find answers. But the more I searched, the more I realized how little of my own life I actually held. The house was in his name. The cars, too. Even the smallest investments I thought were mine were tied somehow to him. My marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a trap. I wish I could say I cried. That I broke down, sobbed until I had no tears left. But the truth is, I didn't cry at all. I felt something colder, sharper. Rage. The kind of rage that comes from years of silence, from 1,000 little humiliations swallowed down with a smile. In that moment, sitting alone in the house, I thought was half mine. I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If Daniel thought he had stripped me of everything, he had underestimated the wrong woman. Because I still had one thing left: myself. And I would use every scar, every wound, every ounce of pain they had given me to take back what was mine. The next morning, I woke before the sun. My body felt heavy, but my mind was electric buzzing with fragments of thought that refused to quiet. For years, I had lulled myself into a kind of numb obedience, smiling at Irene's cutting remarks, forgiving Daniel's absences, pretending not to notice the walls of my life narrowing inch by inch. But now, the illusion had shattered. My cards were blocked, my accounts drained, and the mask I had worn so carefully was slipping away. I stood in the kitchen staring at the half-empty coffee pot Daniel had left behind before his so-called business trip. It hit me how many mornings I had brewed that pot for him, always careful to get it just the way he liked it, even when I didn't have time for breakfast myself. Small acts of service, small sacrifices, thousands of them stacked up like bricks. And now, every single one of those bricks pressed down on my chest like a weight. I needed to know why. Not just why the accounts were blocked, but why I had been so foolish to trust a man who could gut my life in a single move. I started digging not in drawers this time, but in memories. I thought back to the early years of our marriage when Daniel would tell me he was taking care of things, brushing off my questions about money or contracts with a gentle laugh. "You don't need to worry about that," he'd say, pulling me into his arms. I thought it was love that he wanted to protect me. But now I realized it had been a carefully constructed cage. By mid-morning, I found myself driving to Irene's house. I told myself it was to return the scarf she'd left in my car after our disastrous lunch. But the truth was uglier. I wanted to see her face. I wanted to know if she knew. Her house, that sprawling colonial with ivy crawling up the bricks, looked as pristine as always. She opened the door wearing pearls as if she had dressed for the role of martyr she so often liked to play. "Oh, it's you," she said, her voice flat. I handed her the scarf, but my hand trembled. "Did you know?" I asked. Her eyes didn't flinch. That more than anything told me the answer. A wife should never be surprised by her husband's choices. She replied, her tone as smooth as silk. "Maybe if you had been more attentive, he wouldn't have had to take matters into his own hands." Her words burned. Attentive. As though every meal I cooked, every insult I swallowed, every dream I put on hold wasn't enough. I wanted to scream, but instead I did something worse. I smiled, and in that smile was the first spark of my revenge. I left her house without another word, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't confront Daniel, not yet. He held all the cards, literally and figuratively. But what he didn't realize was that his arrogance had given me an advantage. He thought I was powerless. He thought shame would silence me. But shame is a strange thing. It can hollow you out, yes, but it can also sharpen you into something dangerous. That night, I pulled out an old shoebox from the back of my closet. Inside were scraps of my past letters, from my parents' photographs, from college receipts I'd kept for no reason I could explain. Among them, I found something I had almost forgotten: a copy of the deed to my grandmother's house. She had left it to me years ago, a quiet inheritance I had never told Daniel about, because he had always insisted on handling the paperwork. The house was old, falling apart at the edges, but it was mine. Mine. For the first time in days, I felt something like hope flicker in my chest. Maybe Daniel thought he had stripped me of everything, but he didn't know about this. And if I had one thing left, I could build from it. But that flicker of hope came with something else, a question. What else had been hidden from me? If Daniel could drain our accounts without a word, what other secrets had been buried beneath the floorboards of our marriage? I began watching, listening, collecting. I called the bank again, asked for records poured over every line like a detective searching for clues. The numbers told a story Daniel had tried to erase. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments to a woman's name I had never heard before. Thousands of dollars disappearing month after month. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was personal, intimate. My husband wasn't just stealing from me. He was funding a life I wasn't part of, a life that included someone else. I remember sitting there in the dim light of my bedroom, the papers spread around me like broken glass, and whispering aloud to no one, "You think you've won, but you don't even know the storm you've woken up." And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just survive this. I wouldn't just crawl out of the wreckage of the life Daniel and his family had tried to bury me in. No, I would rise from it. And when I did, I would take everything from them. Not just money, not just status. I would take the very ground they stood on, the lies they had built their lives upon. Because revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about balance. And for the first time, I was ready to tip the scales. In the days that followed, my life became a theater of silence. Outwardly, I played the part of the abandoned wife with grace, answering Irene's passive-aggressive phone calls with calm civility, nodding politely when neighbors asked if Daniel was traveling again. Inside, however, I was plotting. Every moment of my day became a chess move, every conversation a potential clue. I no longer looked at my marriage as a love story gone wrong. It was a puzzle, and the pieces were starting to click into place. The papers I had uncovered gnawed at me. The transfers, the unfamiliar woman's name. At first, I thought she might have been a mistress. It wouldn't have surprised me. Daniel had always carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed women should orbit him like planets around a sun. But something about the regularity of the payments felt different. This wasn't romantic extravagance. It was methodical, planned, consistent. And it made my stomach knot in a way that betrayal alone couldn't explain. I decided to find her. It took me 3 weeks of careful digging, pulling at threads Daniel never thought I'd notice. I called the bank again, pretending to be a confused wife, trying to understand her husband's financial records. I dug through his office at night, rifling through drawers with shaking hands, terrified he'd return before I put everything back exactly where it had been. Eventually, I found a letter tucked between insurance documents with the same name I'd seen on the payments. Not just a name, an address. The first time I drove past the house, I nearly turned back. It was small, modest, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Not the kind of place Daniel would ever be seen near. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles went white. What was I hoping to find? Proof that he had been unfaithful? Another family he was supporting in secret? I didn't have to wonder long. A woman came out onto the porch, young, maybe mid-20s, holding a toddler on her hip. The boy had hair the same shade of chestnut as Daniel's, and even from a distance, I could see the familiar sharpness in his jawline. My breath caught in my throat. I had always imagined betrayal as a sharp stab, a single wound. But this was a slow bleed. My husband hadn't just betrayed me. He had been living a double life, a secret child, a secret family. Years of lies stitched together into the costume of a respectable man. I sat in the car for a long time, my pulse pounding in my ears, watching the woman bounce the child on her hip. She looked tired, worn the way I had once looked when Daniel first began disappearing on business trips. Suddenly, I understood the payments. He wasn't generous. He was cautious. He was paying her to keep quiet, to keep his secret locked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the silence of our bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though my whole body was filled with static. Rage doesn't even begin to describe what I felt. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It wasn't just about Irene and her cruel little smirks, or about the humiliation at that restaurant. It was about the years of my life stolen from me. My youth, my trust, my love, all consumed by a man who thought I would never fight back. But I wasn't the same woman who had sat helplessly in that bistro, cheeks burning with shame. I wasn't the obedient wife who had swallowed Irene's insults, who had let Daniel's lies lull her into complacency. No. That woman had died the moment my cards were declined. In her place was someone sharper, colder, someone who knew exactly what she had to do. I started small. I moved into my grandmother's house, fixing it up piece by piece, with what little savings I had hidden away, scraping by on freelance work and odd jobs. It wasn't easy. I had grown used to the comfort Daniel's money had provided, even if it had come wrapped in chains. But there was something liberating about it too. For the first time in years, every decision I made was mine. Every nail hammered into those old wooden walls was a reminder I wasn't powerless. At the same time, I gathered evidence. I documented everything: bank statements, letters, photographs. I kept a journal of dates, times, conversations. I didn't know exactly how I would use it yet, but I knew I needed it. Revenge isn't impulsive, it's patient. And as I worked, as I watched the pieces of my life slowly come back together, I realized something crucial: Daniel wasn't careful enough. He had grown arrogant, certain I was too weak, too dependent to ever question him. That arrogance would be his downfall. I still remember the moment I told myself out loud, standing in the middle of my grandmother's half-renovated kitchen, paintbrush in hand, "I'm going to take everything from you." My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I believed it with every cell in my body. Because what Daniel didn't understand, what Irene had never understood, was that the woman they mocked, belittled, and underestimated had finally woken up. And once you wake up from a nightmare, you don't go back to sleep. I worked like a woman possessed. Days blurred into nights as I sanded floorboards, painted window frames, and turned my grandmother's house from a tired relic into a place that felt like shelter instead of exile. I learned how to patch a leaky roof with YouTube videos and the stubborn patience that comes from having nothing left to lose. Each small fix was a victory, each hole filled a promise to myself that I would not be hollowed out by anyone again. But while my hands did the honest grounding work of rebuilding, my mind moved on a different track, quiet, meticulous, and colder than I'd ever been. I was gathering proof, laying tracks that would lead to a reckoning. The more I dug, the more I found. Daniel's arrogance, his belief that I would always be too blind or too loyal, made him sloppy. There were invoices with inflated amounts, contracts signed in my name for things I'd never heard of, and transfers routed through shell accounts that, when traced, led to that small house on the edge of town where I had seen the woman and the child. I made copies, took photos, organized everything into folders, labeled with dates and little notes, my personal ledger of betrayal. Each paper I held felt heavy with the past he had tried to bury. I also found evidence of other kinds of theft emotional bookkeeping that had catalog entries like "favor to Marianne" or "cover for Irene." My mother-in-law's neat signature appeared on documents authorizing transfers she pretended not to know about. Marianne's contributions, small at first, multiplied in ways that suggested complicity rather than ignorance. The web of lies included more people than I had expected, and every new thread tightened the noose around their polished lives. It hurt, of course. A rawness returned every time I saw Irene's script on a decree, or Marianne's initials on a fake invoice. But the hurt was tempered by clarity. I was not imagining injustice. I was cataloging it. One evening, in a fit of exhaustion and something like resolve, I drove to the small house where the woman lived. I did not go to accuse. I went with curiosity and perhaps a trembling hope that there might be someone else who had been as deceived as I had. She answered the door with a child at her hip, and suspicion in her eyes, the same guarded look I had worn so many times when strangers knocked on our life's doors. Her name was Hannah, and the conversation that followed was not the dramatic confrontation I had rehearsed in my head. Instead, it was two women unspooling the same cruel thread, how he'd filled their lives with promises, how money had been sent like a bribe to keep mouths closed, how loneliness had been softened with lies. Hannah had been terrified at first, certain I was there to demand money or make threats. When I showed her the records, the transfers, the dates, the way Daniel had signed away parts of my life without my knowledge, her face shifted. Gradually, suspicion yielded to understanding, and then to anger. She told me things I hadn't known: how he visited rarely at first, then more often, how he asked for silence because reputation was everything, how the payments were called support, though they never reached the child's school fees without strings attached. She kept receipts he had given her, small, tattered things that, when placed against the ledger, I had built fit like pieces of a broken vase. Together, our documentation became a map of his duplicity. There is a strange power in shared hurt. Hannah and I stood in her shabby kitchen, the child playing at our feet, and we mapped out the truth between us. We decided we would not be pitted against each other. We were not rivals in some petty drama. We were both victims of the same man's cowardice. The alliance changed something in me that I didn't expect. Revenge had felt for a long time like a solitary heat, an ember in my chest. I fed with rage. But justice, I realized, was colder, more strategic, and also strangely purer when it came with solidarity. Hannah wanted safety and recognition for her child. I wanted the life that had been stolen from me, acknowledged and returned, in whatever legal and emotional form it could be. Our aims overlapped. I hired a lawyer. I had never needed one before. My life had been administered by someone else who handled the paperwork and smiled when people complimented his practical nature. Now I sat across from a woman with sharp eyes and the calm of someone who had weathered countless storms. She listened without surprise as I laid out pages of records, bank statements, and the notes I'd kept like a ledger of betrayal. She explained the mechanisms I already suspected: joint accounts, forged signatures, and the ways men like Daniel hid liabilities behind a facade of respectability. She also laid out the path forward: freezing certain assets, filing for an immediate injunction, and most importantly, setting up a legal framework that would make it harder for them to gaslight or bully us into silence. This is where the planning stopped feeling like revenge and started feeling, at least to me, like repair. I was not simply trying to humiliate them for what they'd done. I was building a case so that children might be supported, so that the precarious financial future they had tried to condemn me to would be secured. I wanted restitution, but I also wanted truth. I wanted their laughter at my expense to be replaced with the gravity of accountability. The lawyer warned me that this would get messy. She warned me that people would try to paint me as vengeful, as unhinged. She was right. I had to steel myself for their counterattacks, the whispers, the social ostracism, the way families can circle the wagons when the facade cracks. So I armor-plated myself with evidence and with Hannah's quiet presence. We made a pact: she would be willing to testify if needed. I would secure the legal backbone. She sent me photographs of the child that matched the dates on my bank statements. I matched them to his school registration forms, and Daniel's pattern of visits. Together, our evidence formed a narrative too coherent to be dismissed as coincidence or malice. I also found something unexpected in the process, a small file in Daniel's documents that contained letters from his estranged father, letters that hinted at long-buried family debts and the pressure that had conditioned him into secrecy and betrayal. It didn't excuse him, it complicated him. He was not merely a villain in a story, it was a man shaped by fear and the toxic upkeep of an image. The knowledge didn't make me kinder. It made me steadier. With every phone call I made, every meeting with the lawyer, every quiet evening spent organizing the ledger, the plan sharpened. I arranged for a bank audit on accounts he controlled, I prepared affidavits, and I lined up witnesses. I also scheduled something that felt dangerous in a way papers never would, a family dinner extended, and public, one of the rare occasions when Daniel's clan loved to display their cohesion. I told myself it would be mere theatrics, an opportunity to watch the faces of those who had mocked me when the truth finally arrived. But beneath the small part of me that craved spectacle was a harder aim to force a reckoning where they had always practiced performance. I wanted the house of cards to fall in full view, not in whispered rumors over coffee. Night after night, as the house slowly came together and the legal boxes filled, I felt a complicated movement in my chest, a mixture of anticipation, grief, and a strange, emerging compassion. Revenge had brought me to the edge, but this careful unmasking, this building with Hannah and with the lawyer, felt like a reclaiming of agency. I was no longer a passive object to be spent or dismissed. I was an architect of consequence. And yet, under the steel of that conviction, a softer question kept sliding across my thoughts. What would I do after the evidence did its work? What would I hold up to the light once they were stripped of their illusions? The answer wasn't clear, but the resolve was, I would not be small anymore. The dinner was set for a Saturday night in early autumn, the kind of evening when the air cools just enough to carry a sharpness, as if nature itself knows that change is coming. Irene insisted on hosting. It was her stage, after all, the grand dining room with its chandelier glowing like fall sunshine, and the table polished until it reflected every movement back at you. I had avoided these dinners for months, claiming headaches, work, or sheer exhaustion. But this time, I had accepted the invitation without hesitation. She thought it meant submission. She thought it meant I was crawling back. She didn't know I was walking into that house with a dagger sharpened and hidden in plain sight. Daniel returned the day before, his smile, as calculated as ever, the air of a man who believed his secrets were still safe. He kissed my cheek, like nothing had happened, like we were still husband and wife in the truest sense. I let him. I had learned that silence, when wielded deliberately, could be sharper than any accusation. He had no idea that I had his life cataloged in folders and flash drives, that his every betrayal was organized and waiting to be revealed. When I arrived at Irene's house that evening, the usual rituals unfolded. Marianne poured wine with a smug flourish. Irene commented on my dress with a compliment so backhanded it nearly drew blood, and Daniel held court with his easy charisma, laughing too loudly at his brother's jokes. For the first 30 minutes, I let it play out like it always had. I smiled when expected, nodded at stories, and played the part of the agreeable wife. Then, just as the main course was being served, I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but it cut through the room like glass. Forks paused, conversations stilled, and all eyes turned toward me. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it might burst, but my voice came out steady, stronger than I had anticipated. I have something to share, I said. Irene's lips curled. Can it wait until after dinner, dear? We wouldn't want to spoil the meal. No, I said softly but firmly. It can't wait. I pulled the envelope from my bag, thick, heavy, filled with copies of documents. I spread them across the table, like a dealer laying down cards. Bank statements, receipts, notarized letters, photographs, pages that told a story they had all worked so hard to hide. Daniel's smile faltered first. He reached for the papers, but I stopped him with a look so cold it froze him mid-motion. Marianne leaned forward, her eyes scanning the transfers, the signatures. Irene's hand twitched toward her pearls, clutching them like a talisman. "You've all mocked me." I began, my voice low but clear. "At lunches, at dinners in this very room. You've treated me like a child, a fool, someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of this family. And yet," I gestured to the papers, "I understand more than you realize." I told them about the frozen accounts, about the humiliation in that restaurant, about the nights I spent piecing together their lies. I told them about Hannah, about the child, about the life Daniel had built in secret while draining mine dry. Each word was a stone hurled into the silence, and each face around that table cracked a little more with every impact. Daniel tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. Years of being talked over had forged a fire in me I hadn't known I possessed. "Don't you dare!" I hissed, my voice shaking with fury. "You took my life apart piece by piece, thinking I would never see the truth. But I did. And I've made sure others will see it too. These documents are already in my lawyer's hands. Copies have been filed with the court. What happens tonight isn't about whether you admit it. It's about watching your empire collapse in front of your own eyes." Irene gasped, clutching the arm of her chair, as though I had struck her. Marianne muttered something under her breath, but her face had gone pale, her eyes darting between me and Daniel like a cornered animal. Daniel sat frozen, his mask slipping for the first time since I'd known him. Beneath the charm and arrogance was something uglier, fear. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the faint clinking of the chandelier swaying above us. Then I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining from me, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not triumph, not yet, but the relief of finally being seen, of dragging the rot into the light. I stood gathering my bag. "I won't stay for dessert," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the room. "I've already had my fill." And with that, I left them there, their polished table covered in the wreckage of their lies. As I walked out into the cool night, the stars felt sharper, closer, as if the sky itself had been waiting for me to step into this moment. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. I had detonated the truth in the one place they valued appearances most. There would be consequences, of course. There always are. But for the first time in a very long time, the weight pressing down on my chest had lifted. I wasn't the woman they mocked anymore. I was the woman who took everything back. The days after the dinner unfolded like the aftermath of an earthquake, silent at first, then filled with the sound of walls crumbling. I returned home that night, braced for calls, texts, maybe even a furious knock at my door, but nothing came. The silence was almost louder than their mockery had ever been. And in that silence, I felt something inside me crack open, a strange mixture of dread and freedom. Daniel finally showed up 2 days later, disheveled and angry in a way I had never seen. He stormed into the house without knocking, slamming the door behind him, his voice low but trembling with rage. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his eyes wild. For years, his anger had terrified me. But this time, it didn't. I looked at him and saw not the man I once believed in, not even the monster he had become, but something smaller. A liar stripped of his armor. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't the one shrinking in the room. I told the truth, I said simply, my hands folded in front of me. "Something you've never managed to do." His face twisted, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, but instead, he sank onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. "Do you even understand what you've done?" His voice cracked, not with guilt, but with fear. "They'll cut me off. I'll lose everything." I almost laughed, the sound bitter and raw. "You'll lose everything. Daniel, you already took everything from me. My savings, my dignity, my trust. What else is there left for you to steal?" He looked up at me, then his eyes shining with something that might have been desperation or calculation. "We can fix this," he said, his voice softer, slipping back into the charm he had always relied on. "We just need to be smart. Tell them you were mistaken, that you overreacted. I'll make it up to you. We'll start fresh." The audacity of it nearly knocked the breath out of me. He thought I would still bend, still play the role of the forgiving wife, the one who absorbed every wound in silence. But I wasn't her anymore. "No," I said firmly. "There's no fixing this. Not anymore." He stared at me, searching for weakness. But all he found was resolve. After a long silence, he stood muttering something I couldn't make out and stormed out of the house. The door slammed, and with it, the last remnants of the life I had clung to closed behind him. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like fire. Irene called once, her voice icy and controlled, accusing me of tearing the family apart. "Do you realize what you've done to us?" she hissed. I held the phone to my ear, my hand trembling but my voice calm. "Yes," I said. "For once I do." Then I hung up. Marianne didn't call, but I heard through whispers, friends of friends, that she and her husband had been cut off from certain funds after the evidence surfaced. The accounts they had lived so lavishly on were frozen, and suddenly the dinners and the smug superiority weren't so easy to maintain. And Daniel, his name began to surface in places he couldn't control. The debts, the hidden accounts, the child he had tried so hard to keep secret, all of it was no longer contained to my files. The world had begun to see the man behind the mask. But if I'm honest, the destruction of their empire wasn't what stayed with me the most. What stayed with me were the quiet moments alone, the silence of my house after the chaos had passed. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the documents I no longer needed to hide, and feel the weight of years pressing down on me. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't heal the wounds. It doesn't erase the nights I spent crying in the dark, or the humiliation I endured at that restaurant, or the countless little cuts they inflicted on me. What it does is something different. It clears the air. It strips away the lies so you can finally breathe again. One night, weeks after the dinner, I went to bed and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for the sound of a door slamming, or a cruel remark, or a secret waiting to shatter me. I lay there in the dark, my chest rising and falling steadily, and I felt something like peace. Fragile, unfamiliar, but real. And yet underneath that peace, there was grief. Grief for the years I had lost. Grief for the woman I had been, who believed love was something you endured rather than something that lifted you. Grief for the version of me who thought she needed their approval to exist. I wish I could say I felt only triumph. But life isn't that simple. The scars don't vanish just because you've turned the knife around. They linger like echoes in the walls, reminding you of what was broken. But still, I survived. And in surviving, I found a strength I didn't know I had. Months passed, and the dust of my rebellion settled into something quieter, but no less profound. Life had a different rhythm now. Mornings weren't filled with dread of another fight, another performance, another wound. Instead, they became moments of small rituals. I had almost forgotten how to enjoy making coffee, just the way I liked it. Reading the paper in silence, watching the sunlight stretch across my kitchen floor without feeling like I was wasting time. Daniel was gone for good. I knew because his lawyer called, not him. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it fast. That should have shattered me, but instead it felt like the final thread snapping loose, leaving me free. His lawyer spoke in clipped tones about amicable resolution and shared assets. But I had already gathered every shred of evidence, every receipt, every document. I didn't just walk away, I walked away with leverage. And for once, the balance of power was in my hands. Irene tried once more to intervene to bully me into silence. She showed up at my door without warning, her hair perfectly coiffed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won, don't you?" She sneered, her eyes sweeping my small home with contempt. "All you've done is expose yourself. Do you think anyone respects a woman who turns on her husband's family?" I should have cowered, but instead, I opened the door wider and met her gaze head on. "I don't need respect from people who never gave me love," I said. My voice didn't shake. For once, she was the one caught off guard. She sputtered, her mask slipping for just a second, and then she turned on her heel and left. It was a small victory, but one that stayed with me. Because standing up to her wasn't just about shutting her down, it was about finally standing up for myself. But even as the pieces of their empire crumbled, something unexpected began to happen. Marianne reached out. It was a short message at first sent from an unfamiliar number. "I'm sorry." At first, I thought it was some cruel joke, but when I called back, her voice on the other end was trembling. "I didn't know everything. Not about Daniel. Not about the money. I should have been kinder to you. I should have listened." I didn't forgive her right away. The wounds were too fresh, the memories too raw. But something in her voice made me pause. For the first time, I heard not mockery or superiority, but regret. She confessed that their finances had collapsed after the truth came out that she and her husband were struggling in ways they had never imagined. She admitted that the mask she wore at every dinner, every holiday, had been her prison too. It didn't excuse her cruelty, but it reminded me of something important, that sometimes even the ones who wound us are also trapped in their own cages. The divorce dragged on for months, but in the end, I walked away with more than I thought possible. The accounts Daniel had hidden were divided, and for once, I had security that wasn't tied to him. I could start fresh, not scraping by, not begging for approval, but living on my own terms. One evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: pride. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had survived them. Because I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, and still found my way back to myself. And yet, there were nights when the ghosts returned. When I would wake from dreams of that dinner, hearing their laughter echoing in my ears. Nights when I would ask myself if revenge had truly been worth it, if stripping them bare had healed me or just deepened the wounds. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of the woman I had been before. The one who swallowed her voice, who lived in fear, who believed her worth was measured by their approval. And then I looked at the woman. I had become the one who stood in the storm, who refused to stay silent, who reclaimed her life piece by piece. The scars would always be there. But scars are proof of healing, not just of pain. One day, not long after the divorce was finalized, I went to lunch alone at a cafe downtown. As I handed over my card to pay, I thought back to that humiliating day with Irene, when every card had been declined, when my humiliation had been their entertainment. But this time, the card went through without a hitch, and I smiled to myself. Not because of the money, but because the power to stand on my own was finally mine. I left a generous tip, walked out into the sunlight, and felt lighter than I had in years. Not long after that lunch, life began to take on a strange, almost surreal stillness. For so many years, my days had been defined by walking on eggshells managing crises, or silently enduring their cruelty. Now there was space to breathe, to think, to rebuild. And yet with that space came something unexpected, the flood of grief I had kept buried for far too long. It hit me in waves. Sometimes, while folding laundry, I would suddenly feel the sting of every insult they had thrown at me. Other times, driving past the restaurant where it all fell apart, I would hear their laughter as if it was still ringing in my ears. And there were nights, dark, endless nights, when I would lie awake and remember the younger version of me, the one who entered that marriage full of hope, believing that love meant sacrifice. I would ache for her innocence, for the way she had been broken down piece by piece until she almost disappeared. But grief, I learned, is not the opposite of healing. It's a part of it. And slowly, as I allowed myself to feel it, I began to notice the strength underneath. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled across journals I had kept in my early 20s. I hadn't read them in years. The handwriting was messy, the words raw and unfiltered. In those pages, I saw a younger me who dreamed of traveling, of writing, of building a life that was her own. She had goals and a fire in her belly long before she was told to dim her light to make others comfortable. I sat on the attic floor for hours, tears streaming down my face, realizing how far I had strayed from her and how badly I wanted to return. That night, I made myself a promise. I would start living again, not as someone's wife, not as someone's scapegoat, but as myself. It wasn't easy. Starting over never is. There were days when I doubted whether I could make it, when the silence of the house felt suffocating, when loneliness clung to me like a second skin. But then there were moments, small, fragile, beautiful moments, when I felt sparks of joy. The first time I booked a trip by myself, the thrill of sitting on a plane knowing no one controlled me. The afternoons I spent writing again, pouring my story onto the page, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Daniel tried to reach out once more months after the divorce was finalized. His message was short, almost pitiful. I made mistakes. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time, my fingers hovering over the screen. A part of me wanted to lash out to remind him of every wound, every betrayal. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger, simply deleted the message. There was no need for words. His chapter in my life was closed. Irene never forgave me. I know that. She cut me out entirely, and in a way that was the greatest gift she could have given. Marianne, on the other hand, continued to reach out from time to time. Our conversations were tentative, awkward, and filled with the weight of our shared past. But with each exchange, the hostility melted, replaced by something that felt like cautious recognition. We would never be close, but at least we could face each other without venom. And as their world continued to unravel, I found myself less interested in watching it burn. The satisfaction of revenge, sharp and intoxicating, at first began to fade. What mattered more was what I built in its place. My independence, my peace, my voice. One evening, I sat on that same porch where I had once nursed my grief, watching the sun dip below the horizon. And I realized something profound, the true revenge, was not in what I took from them. It was in what I reclaimed for myself, my freedom, my dignity, my future. They could no longer touch me. No insult, no manipulation, no betrayal could undo the woman I had become. The real turning point came almost a year after that infamous dinner on a winter evening, when the air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of smoke from nearby fireplaces. I had been invited hesitantly, nervously, by an old friend I hadn't seen in years to join her for Christmas Eve dinner. For a long time, I debated whether to go. Holidays had become tainted in my memory, stained by the endless charades at Daniel's family table, where every smile was a mask and every word a weapon. But something in me knew I couldn't keep hiding. So I went. The house was warm, alive with laughter and music, the kind of easy joy I had almost forgotten existed. Children darted through the halls, their faces flushed with excitement, and the dining table was heavy with food, not judgment. When my friend introduced me to her cousins and neighbors, no one looked at me like I was an outsider. No one mocked me or asked invasive questions meant to cut me down. For the first time in years, I felt what it meant to belong. As I sat there, passing plates of food, listening to stories, and even daring to laugh, I realized how small my world had become under Daniel and his family's shadow. How much of myself I had surrendered in the name of survival, and how much life there still was to live beyond them. It was a revelation so sharp, it almost brought me to tears at the table. I excused myself, stepping outside into the cold night air, and let the tears fall, not from pain this time, but from release. I understood then that my story was not just about betrayal or revenge. It was about resurrection, about finding a way to rise from the ruins, carrying the scars, but refusing to be defined by them. In the months that followed, I leaned into that realization. I took the trips I had once only dreamed of. I rebuilt friendships I had let wither away. I even started a small business, something that had always lived in the back of my mind, but seemed impossible while I was tethered to people who thrived on keeping me small. Each step was terrifying, but each step was mine. There were still moments when the past tried to creep back in an unexpected reminder, a name overheard, a memory triggered. But instead of drowning in it, I learned to let it wash over me and then let it go. I heard through whispers, through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, that Daniel's life had unraveled further. His financial dealings caught up with him in ways I never could have orchestrated. Irene's health began to decline, and with it, her iron grip over the family. Marianne moved away quietly, almost as if she wanted to escape the wreckage. And me, I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. Because by then, I didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the natural consequence of the lives they chose to live. My victory was quieter, but infinitely greater, the ability to live without them. One night, as I sat journaling a habit I had revived, I wrote something that stayed with me. The sweetest revenge is a life lived free, a life that no longer needs to remember their names to have meaning. That was my truth. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: sometimes the people closest to us can wound us in ways that seem impossible to recover from. Sometimes the betrayal cuts so deep that it feels like you'll never find yourself again. But healing doesn't come from destroying them, it comes from choosing yourself, from stepping out of their shadows and learning how to stand in your own light. If you've ever been mocked, silenced, or betrayed by those who should have loved you most, know this: you are not alone, and your story is not over. You are stronger than they ever wanted you to believe. And if my journey means anything, Let it be proof that even in the aftermath of betrayal, there is still life, there is still hope, and there is still a chance to reclaim everything they tried to take from you. If my story touched you, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like mine. And please leave a comment below. I'd love to know if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal and how you found the strength to rise again. Because together, our voices can turn pain into power.